The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as Captain Reynolds made her way through the bustling terminal. The familiar sound of rolling suitcases and early morning announcements filled the air. She had arrived 3 hours before her scheduled flight to Los Angeles, just as she had done countless times before during her 15-year career as a commercial airline pilot. Her Boeing 787 uniform fitted perfectly as always, with her 4 stripes gleaming under the airport lights. She'd earned every single one of those stripes through years of dedication, countless training hours, and an unwavering passion for aviation that started when she was just a little girl watching planes take off from her backyard. As she walked through the terminal, she couldn't help but notice the mix of travelers, families heading to vacation, business people buried in their phones, and elderly couples holding hands as they made their way to their gates. It was these everyday moments that reminded her why she loved her job so much. Every flight meant being part of someone's story, whether it was a crucial business meeting, a long-awaited family reunion, or simply a journey home. Her morning routine was interrupted by a notification on her phone. Her first officer had called in sick, something about a bad case of food poisoning from last night's dinner. It wasn't ideal, but these things happened. The airline had already arranged for a replacement, whom she'd be meeting shortly. However, this last-minute change meant she'd need to handle some additional pre-flight preparations. Captain Reynolds reached into her flight bag and pulled out her tablet, double-checking the weather reports for their route to Los Angeles. Clear skies were predicted across most states, with only some light turbulence expected over New Mexico. She made mental notes of alternative routes, just as she always did. Being prepared wasn't just a habit for her, it was a way of life. As she approached the crew check-in desk, she noticed several eyes following her movement through the terminal. She was used to it by now. Even in 2024, some people still did a double take at seeing a black woman in a captain's uniform. But she never let it bother her. If anything, it motivated her to excel even more. The crew lounge was quieter than usual for a Thursday morning. She grabbed a cup of coffee, black with just a hint of honey, her pre-flight ritual for the past decade. As she sipped the warm drink, she reviewed the passenger manifest and flight plan one more time. The flight was full, with several VIP passengers in first class. Little did she know that this routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Her phone buzzed again, another message from crew scheduling. Due to the last-minute crew change, there seemed to be some confusion with her positioning flight seat assignment. She'd need to sort that out at the gate. She gathered her things, adjusted her uniform one last time, and headed toward Gate B23. The terminal was getting busier now, with the morning rush in full swing. Children waved at her as she passed, and she smiled back, remembering how she used to be that child, dreaming of flying high in the sky. 15 years of flying experience, over 10,000 flight hours, and countless successful landings had prepared her for almost any situation in the air. But sometimes, she reflected, the most challenging moments happened right here on the ground. As she approached the gate desk, she had no idea that she was about to face one of those moments, one that would not only test her professionalism, but would also spark a conversation that needed to be had. The clock showed 6:45 a.m. Her flight was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. Plenty of time to sort out this seating situation and complete her pre-flight checks. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward the gate counter, her pilot's license and crew ID ready in hand. The morning was about to take an unexpected turn that would leave everyone at Gate B23 in complete shock. The gate area was starting to fill up with early morning travelers. Some were sipping their coffee while others were tapping away on their laptops, trying to squeeze in those last few work emails before boarding. Captain Reynolds approached the counter, where a gate agent was rapidly typing on their computer, barely glancing up as passengers dropped off their gate check bags. "Good morning," Captain Reynolds said warmly, placing her crew ID on the counter. "I need to check my seat assignment for the positioning flight till X. There seems to be some confusion due to the crew change this morning." The gate agent, whose name tag read P. Morris, continued typing without looking up. "Name?" they asked, their tone carrying that particular blend of airport efficiency and early morning fatigue. "Captain Reynolds. I'm operating the return flight from Los Angeles this afternoon." She slid her credentials closer to the agent's line of sight. Years of experience had taught her that a gentle but firm approach usually worked best in these situations. Finally looking up, the agent's fingers paused over the keyboard. Their eyes darted between the credentials and Captain Reynolds, then back to the computer screen. "I'm showing you're on the standby list. Economy class." "There must be some mistake," Captain Reynolds explained patiently. "As operating crew for the return flight, I should be seated in first class. It's standard protocol." She could feel a few curious glances from nearby passengers, but she maintained her professional demeanor. The agent's brow furrowed as they clicked through several screens. "First class is completely full. Besides," they paused, giving Captain Reynolds' uniform an obvious once-over. "We need to verify your credentials. Anyone can purchase a pilot's uniform online these days." A businessman waiting nearby looked up from his phone, his eyebrows raised. A couple sitting in the adjacent seats exchanged glances. The air around the gate desk suddenly felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Captain Reynolds took a deep breath, drawing from her years of experience handling difficult situations at 35,000 feet. "I understand your concern for security," she said, her voice steady and clear. "My credentials are valid and current. You can verify them with crew scheduling or the chief pilot's office. I'm sure we can sort this out professionally." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her emails, finding the crew assignment notification she'd received earlier. A young girl tapped on her mother's sleeve nearby, pointing excitedly at Captain Reynolds' uniform. Despite the situation unfolding, she gave the child a warm smile. She never forgot how important representation was, especially in moments like these. More passengers were starting to pay attention now. An elderly woman who'd been quietly knitting in her seat set her needles down to watch. Two flight attendants from another airline paused their conversation, recognizing the situation unfolding before them. The gate agent's fingers moved across the keyboard again, but their expression remained skeptical. "All I'm seeing is a standby listing, and given the unusual circumstances, we'll need additional verification." "Unusual circumstances," Captain Reynolds repeated quietly, letting the words hang in the air. The terminal noise seemed to fade into the background as several nearby passengers stopped their conversations to listen. A flight attendant preparing for boarding at the next gate overnoticed the interaction and started walking over. She had worked with Captain Reynolds on previous flights and recognized her immediately. But before she could reach the desk, something unexpected happened that would change the entire course of the morning. The growing tension at Gate B23 was about to reach its turning point. As more eyes turned toward the desk, it became clear that this wasn't just about a seat assignment anymore. This was about to become a moment that would make everyone rethink their own biases and assumptions, a moment that would soon go viral for all the right reasons. Little did anyone know that among the watching passengers was someone whose voice would add an entirely new dimension to this unfolding situation. As Captain Reynolds stood there, maintaining her composure despite the growing frustration, she had no idea that the next few minutes would not only change her day, but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond Gate B23. The next few moments at Gate B23 unfolded like a scene from a movie, but this was very real. Captain Reynolds stood at the counter, her hand resting firmly on her credentials, while the gate agent continued to cast doubt on her identity. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal windows seemed to spotlight this moment of truth. "Let me explain this again," Captain Reynolds said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used during turbulent flights. "I'm the captain for Flight 1372, returning from Los Angeles this afternoon. These are my valid credentials, and I need to be seated in first class as per crew protocols." The gate agent crossed their arms, speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear clearly. "Ma'am, as I said, anyone can buy a uniform these days. We have strict security protocols." The emphasis on "ma'am" carried a weight that everyone within earshot could feel. A middle-aged woman in a business suit stopped typing on her laptop and removed her earbuds. Two teenagers who had been absorbed in their phones looked up, sensing the tension in the air. An off-duty flight attendant from another airline shook her head in disbelief. Captain Reynolds took out her phone and pulled up additional documentation. "I can show you my flight schedule, my pilot's license, and my airline ID. I can also have you contact crew scheduling directly." Her voice remained steady, but those paying attention could hear the weariness of someone who had faced this situation too many times before. A young boy nearby tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, why don't they believe she's a pilot? She has the uniform and everything." The innocent question hung in the air, making several adults shift uncomfortably in their seats. The gate agent's response came with a slight eye roll. "Look, the first-class cabin is full of our premium passengers. We can't just—" "Premium passengers?" Captain Reynolds interrupted, finally allowing a hint of frustration to color her voice. "I've been flying for this airline for 15 years. I've logged over 10,000 flight hours. I've handled emergency landings in extreme weather conditions. I'm not asking for special treatment, I'm asking for standard crew protocols to be followed." The crowd at the gate had grown oddly quiet now. The usual airport sounds of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements seemed distant. A businessman who had been pretending to read his newspaper hadn't turned the page in 5 minutes, too invested in the scene unfolding before him. An older gentleman in a pilot's retirement pin stood up from his seat. The way he carried himself suggested years of aviation experience. He began making his way toward the counter, but before he could reach it, something unexpected happened. A young woman in the waiting area had been recording the interaction on her phone. "I can't believe this is happening in 2024, she whispered to her seatmate. "My daughter wants to be a pilot, and this is what she might face." The tension at the gate had reached a tipping point. Captain Reynolds reached for her phone again, this time to call the chief pilot's office directly. But before she could dial, a familiar voice called out from behind the counter. "Captain Reynolds, I thought that was you." The entire gate area turned to see who had spoken. The next few moments would transform this confrontation into something none of the witnesses would ever forget. As heads turned toward the new voice, the atmosphere at Gate B23 was about to shift dramatically. Nobody knew it yet, but this incident was about to go far beyond a simple seating dispute. The videos being recorded would soon reach millions, sparking important conversations in break rooms and boardrooms across the country. But right now, in this moment, Captain Reynolds stood her ground, embodying the professionalism and dignity that had carried her through countless challenges in her career. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, illuminating the scene as it reached its crucial turning point. The next few minutes would not only resolve this situation, but would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The question wasn't just about who would sit in first class anymore. It had become about something much bigger, something that would resonate with people far beyond this airport gate. The familiar voice that had called out belonged to Mrs. Thompson, a senior flight attendant with over 2 decades of experience. She was walking briskly toward the gate counter, her own crew badge clearly visible on her uniform. But she wasn't the only one stepping forward to support Captain Reynolds. Among the watching passengers was Dr. Wilson, a university professor who specialized in organizational behavior. He had been quietly observing the situation while recording it on his phone. As a frequent flyer with over 2 million miles under his belt, he knew airline protocols inside and out. "Excuse me," he said, standing up from his seat near the window. "I've been flying this airline for 20 years, and I've never seen such a blatant disregard for crew protocols." His voice was firm but measured, carrying the weight of someone used to speaking in lecture halls. The gate agent's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. More passengers were pulling out their phones now, some recording, others typing rapidly, presumably sharing the incident on social media. The hashtag Respect the Captain would soon start trending, though nobody knew it yet. A retired airline executive sitting in the priority boarding area set aside his coffee and walked over. His airline pin, slightly faded but still distinct, caught the morning light. "I helped write some of these protocols," he said quietly. "What's happening here is completely unacceptable." The scene was drawing attention from neighboring gates now. 2 pilots from another airline, waiting for their own crew shuttle, made their way over. Their presence added another layer of professional solidarity to the situation. Meanwhile, a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, when I said I wanted to be a pilot, is this what you meant about it being hard?" The mother's eyes welled up as she hugged her daughter closer, the question hitting harder than any adult intervention could. Mrs. Thompson had reached the counter by now and was speaking in low, urgent tones to the gate agent. "I've flown with Captain Reynolds numerous times. She's one of our most experienced pilots. This is ridiculous." The growing crowd had created a strange bubble of tension in the usually busy terminal. A group of business travelers who had been busy with their laptops were now fully engaged in the scene. One of them, a woman in a crisp suit, was already on the phone with the airline's customer service. "Yes, I'm a Platinum member," she was saying clearly, "and I'm watching one of your captains being discriminated against at Gate B23. I want to speak to a supervisor immediately." An elderly couple who had been quietly waiting for their flight held hands tightly as they watched. The wife wiped away tears, whispering to her husband, "Remember when our daughter wanted to be a pilot? This is why she gave up." Dr. Wilson was still recording, his steady hand capturing everything. His university training kicked in as he documented not just the main confrontation, but the reactions around the gate, the shock, the support, the growing wave of solidarity. A flight attendant from a neighboring gate had called her union representative. Another passenger was tweeting about the incident, his fingers flying over his phone screen. The story was already spreading beyond the confines of Gate B23. The young woman who had been recording since the beginning stood up, her hands slightly shaking but her voice clear. "I'm a law student," she announced, "and I would be very interested in knowing how the airline plans to address this clear violation of crew protocols and possibly more." The gate area had become surprisingly quiet, the usual airport chaos muted by the gravity of the moment. Every eye was on the scene unfolding at the counter. The gate agent's earlier confidence had withered under the weight of so many witnesses and their unmistakable support for Captain Reynolds. But it was the next moment that would truly change everything. Through the crowd, a familiar figure was approaching, someone whose presence would transform this incident from a local dispute into a watershed moment for the airline industry. The morning sun streaming through the terminal windows seemed to pause, as if aware that history was about to be made at Gate B23. The familiar figure walking purposefully through the terminal was Mr. Richardson, the terminal operations supervisor. His 25 years of experience were evident in his confident stride and the immediate attention he commanded. Someone had alerted him to the situation, and his arrival marked a crucial turning point in the morning's events. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of handling airport crises. His eyes swept over the scene. The crowd of concerned passengers, the phones recording everything, Captain Reynolds standing dignified despite the ordeal, and the now nervous gate agent. The air in Gate B23 seemed to crackle with anticipation. A young intern who had been quietly updating social media from the corner whispered to his seatmate, "This video already has thousands of views, and it's only been up for 10 minutes. Mr. Richardson listened intently as both sides explained the situation. His expression darkened as he reviewed Captain Reynolds' credentials, which were of course completely legitimate. The gate agent's face had turned a shade paler, realizing the gravity of their mistake. "Captain Reynolds," the supervisor said, his voice now carrying a note of sincere regret, "I want to personally apologize for this situation. Your credentials are not only valid but exemplary." He turned to face the gate agent, whose keyboard typing had completely ceased. "This is absolutely unacceptable." A mother holding her sleeping toddler smiled quietly, nodding in approval. Next to her, an off-duty pilot who had been watching the scene unfold finally relaxed his tense shoulders. The retired airline executive who had spoken up earlier pulled out his business card, writing something on the back. The supervisor continued, his voice now carrying across the gate area. "Not only is Captain Reynolds one of our most experienced pilots, but she's also been nominated for the Airline Excellence Award 3 times. This revelation caused a stir among the passengers, many of whom were familiar with the prestigious award. The gate agent, now visibly flustered, began rapidly typing again. I can arrange for a first-class seat immediately," they stammered, their earlier skepticism replaced by obvious embarrassment. "That would be appropriate," Mr. Richardson replied firmly. "And we'll need to discuss proper protocol afterward." His tone made it clear that this discussion would be more than a casual chat. An elderly man who had been quietly observing spoke up, his voice carrying years of wisdom. "You know, I've been flying since the 1960s. things have changed a lot, but some things. He paused, looking meaningfully around the gate. Some things still need to change. The young law student who had spoken up earlier was still recording. "This is going to be a case study in my aviation law class," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Several passengers nodded in agreement. Mr. Richardson turned back to Captain Reynolds. "Captain, your new boarding pass is being printed now. Would you like to file a formal report about this incident?" His question hung in the air, heavy with significance. Before she could answer, a group of pilots from another airline who had gathered nearby stepped forward. "We'd be willing to provide statements," one of them offered. "This kind of thing has to stop." The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays streaming through the terminal windows, creating an almost spotlight effect on the scene. The regular airport announcements continued in the background, but at Gate B23, everyone was focused on this moment of accountability and change. A young girl who had been watching everything with wide eyes turned to her father. "Dad, when I grow up and become a pilot, will people treat me like this?" The father hugged her close, his eyes meeting Captain Reynolds' across the gate area. In that silent exchange, both adults recognized the weight of the moment and the work still needed to be done. The next few minutes would prove crucial in transforming this incident from a personal slight into a catalyst for institutional change. As Mr. Richardson began implementing immediate corrective actions, nobody in Gate B23 realized they were witnessing a moment that would soon become a turning point in aviation history. The resolution at Gate B23 unfolded with the kind of efficiency that only comes when top management gets involved. Within minutes, Captain Reynolds had her new boarding pass in hand, C2A, right where airline protocol dictated she should be. But what happened next showed that this incident would have ripples far beyond a simple seating arrangement. Mr. Richardson personally escorted the gate agent away from the counter, replacing them with a more experienced staff member. As they walked away, passengers could hear him saying firmly, "We need to have a serious conversation about company policies and professional conduct." The new gate agent, Mrs. Baker, a veteran of 15 years, immediately took charge of the situation. Her voice carried across the gate area as she made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience. We'll begin boarding in just a few minutes, starting with our first-class passengers and active flight crew members." The passengers who had witnessed everything began sharing their contact information with each other. A business executive handed Captain Reynolds his card, saying quietly, "My daughter's in flight school. Would you be willing to speak to her class someday? They need to hear about this." The young law student who had recorded everything was already in touch with the airline's corporate office. "Yes, I have video documentation of the entire incident," she was saying into her phone. "And about 30 witnesses who are willing to provide statements." A flight attendant from another airline approached Captain Reynolds. "You know, we've all experienced something like this," she said softly. "But not many of us have had the courage to stand our ground like you did. Thank you." The retired airline executive who had spoken up earlier was now on his phone with former colleagues. "No, you need to hear about this," he was saying. "This is exactly why we need those new training programs we discussed at the last board meeting." Social media was already buzzing with activity. The young intern who had been posting updates showed her phone to nearby passengers. The hashtag #RespectYourCaptain was trending nationwide. Videos of the incident were being shared thousands of times per minute. Mrs. Baker started the boarding process, but something unusual happened. As Captain Reynolds approached the jet bridge, the first-class passengers stood up and began applauding. It wasn't the loud, showy kind of applause you might hear at a sports event. It was dignified, respectful, and deeply meaningful. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve as they waited to board. "Mom, why is everyone clapping?" The mother bent down and explained quietly, "Because sometimes people need to stand up for what's right, and when they do, it's important to support them." The original gate agent was now sitting in a corner office with Mr. Richardson and 2 other supervisors. Through the office window, their serious expressions told their own story about the consequences of poor judgment and bias. As Captain Reynolds walked down the jet bridge, fellow crew members lined up to shake her hand. One senior pilot whispered, "You've done more for aviation today than you realize. This isn't just about one seat assignment anymore." The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the gate area. Passengers were boarding the plane, many stopping to share words of support with Captain Reynolds. Some offered their business cards, others simply nodded in respect. The airline's social media team was already in crisis management mode, but surprisingly, the public reaction wasn't what they expected. Instead of criticism, they were seeing an outpouring of support for Captain Reynolds and calls for industry-wide changes in training and protocol. As the last passengers boarded the plane, Mr. Richardson returned to make one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, in light of today's events, our airline will be implementing immediate changes to our training programs and protocols. We appreciate your support in upholding our values of respect and professionalism." The gate area was quieting down now, returning to its normal rhythm of announcements and rolling suitcases. But something had changed at Gate B23. The morning's events had transformed an ordinary airport gate into a place where change began, where courage stood its ground, and where respect finally won out over prejudice. 3 months after the incident at Gate B23, the impact of that morning continued to ripple through the aviation industry. What started as a confrontation over a first-class seat had transformed into a movement for change, touching lives far beyond that Atlanta terminal. The airline's corporate headquarters had been buzzing with activity since that day. In a sleek conference room on the top floor, Captain Reynolds sat at the head of a newly formed diversity and inclusion committee. Around her were pilots, flight attendants, and executives from various airlines, all united in their mission to create lasting change. "The numbers speak for themselves," she explained, pointing to a presentation screen. "Since we implemented the new training program, reported incidents of bias have dropped by 60%. But more importantly, applications from minority candidates for our pilot training program have doubled." The young law student who recorded the original incident was now an intern at the airline's legal department. Her video had become required viewing in their corporate training sessions. "It's not just about avoiding discrimination," she told new employees. "It's about creating an environment where everyone can succeed." Down in the airport terminal, things had changed too. The wall near Gate B23 now displayed a photo series titled "Faces of Aviation," a celebration of diversity in the industry. Passengers often stopped to look at the images, pointing out pilots, engineers, and air traffic controllers from all walks of life. The retired airline executive who had spoken up that day had come out of retirement to lead sensitivity training sessions. "When I started in this industry," he would tell his classes, "we talked about diversity as a requirement. Now we understand it's our strength." In flight schools across the country, the story had become legendary. A young flight instructor stood before her class, sharing her own experiences. "You might have seen the viral video," she said to her students, "but what you didn't see was how that moment changed things for all of us." Captain Reynolds had received hundreds of letters from aspiring pilots. One afternoon, she sat in the crew room reading a particularly touching one. "Dear Captain, I'm 12 years old, and I never thought I could be a pilot until I saw you stand up for yourself. Now I know I can fly too." The gate agent from that morning had gone through extensive retraining and now led workshops on unconscious bias. "I learned the hard way," they would say, "but sometimes the hardest lessons create the most positive change." Social media had played its part too. The trending hashtag had evolved into a movement, with pilots and aviation professionals sharing their own stories of overcoming barriers. Each post added another voice to the chorus calling for change. In the months following the incident, the airline had promoted Captain Reynolds to chief pilot of her base, the first woman of color to hold the position. But she insisted this wasn't about personal achievement. "This is about opening doors," she said in her acceptance speech. "Not just for one person, but for everyone who dreams of flying." Elementary schools began inviting pilots from diverse backgrounds to speak to their students. During one such visit, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "If someone tells me I can't do something because of how I look, what should I do?" Captain Reynolds smiled at the question. "Stand your ground," she answered. "Know your worth. And remember that for every person who doubts you, there are hundreds who will support you when you're right." The airline industry had taken notice. New policies were being implemented across multiple carriers. Training programs were being revised. Hiring practices were being examined and updated. the incident at Gate B23 had become a catalyst for systemic change. 1 year after the incident, the airline hosted a special event. Pilots from across the country gathered to launch a mentorship program for aspiring aviators from underrepresented groups. The location: Gate B23, of course, now known as the Gateway to Change among airport staff. As Captain Reynolds addressed the crowd at the launch event, she spotted a familiar face, the little girl who had watched everything unfold that morning a year ago. She was wearing a pilot's cap and clutching a model airplane. "The sky isn't just the limit," Captain Reynolds told the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the weight of experience and the hope of future generations. "It's our workplace, and it belongs to everyone brave enough to reach for it." The story of Gate B23 had become more than just a viral moment or a corporate case study. It had become a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, the importance of allies speaking out, and the possibility of turning a moment of confrontation into a movement for positive change. And somewhere high above the clouds, in cockpits across the world, a new generation of pilots was taking flight, their paths made a little easier by the courage shown on that morning at Gate B23.